beginning, I have a brief Mark Ciavarella abused a position of trust and inflicted a deep on the community that
Luzerne County, investigate the corruption. People have to hear.
with another judge, and both of them used deceit, bluster, bullying, and a web of lies to conceal their misdeeds.
Where is he?
The evidence at trial proved that conclusively, and we saw it directly manifested through statements of the defendant made prior to the trial, at the trial, and even today. The sentence of the court today was fair, just, and in accordance with the law and the federal sentencing guidelines. Those guidelines properly gave weight to all relevant conduct, including the harm to the community as individuals, and to the harm done by the defendant's specific criminal conduct and his failure to accept responsibility when it was absolutely required to do so. I feel it's absolutely necessary to acknowledge the fine, disciplined, and dedicated work of the IRS agents and FBI agents in this very, very difficult investigation over a period of years. And I can't speak highly enough, and I think your applause is being meant to them rather than to me. Gordon Zubrod, Bill Hauser, and Mike Consiglio, with the able support of Chris Sannick, and the support staff of the U.S. Attorney's Office, the incredibly intense and dedicated work that they did on this case. And I also have to thank the unsung heroes, the U.S. Marshal Service and the Federal Security for their quiet and steady dedication to the safety of this building and the proceedings that take place in it, and to the public who are so interested in this trial and overlook their role. I think it's appropriate to say something with regard to the injuries to individual victims and the interconnected relationship between the relevant conduct of charges and the terrible overall impact of Ciavarella's conduct. Assistant U.S. Attorney Zubrod this morning said a case of wholesale abuse and harm to individuals rather than retail. And by way of explaining that, I'd like to clarify it briefly. The individuals and their families and the public, we say that your concerns were not ignored during the investigation, the prosecution, or the sentencing. Your letters were read. We saw the findings of the interbranch commission, which we found very convincing and very persuasive, and the many articles and stories that appeared in the media constantly about this case. The individuals who expressed their concerns and their complaints and their grievances through all these media were an additional impetus, if that was needed, for all the prosecutors and investigators to do their job and to pursue it diligently to like this case. The juvenile justice system is the responsibility primarily of the state of Pennsylvania. You can't decide or rehear juvenile cases in the federal criminal proceedings for racketeering, bribery, extortion, and tax charges. It is fair to say that there was no evidence presented regarding the specific cash payment to Ciavarella or to Connie or any particular individual juvenile sent to facilities by power of miracle. This is a very clever and interesting lawyer's argument for the defense to make that somehow that makes him innocent. It's our contention that the facts show clearly here that it was an overall corrupt scheme that contaminated the entire system. In a sense, every individual who appeared before Ciavarella and every individual who was involved in one way or another in the juvenile court proceedings in Luzerne County for those years was harmed and adversely affected by the actions of Ciavarella. All the while he was sitting on the bench and deciding those cases and sending juveniles to one place or another. He was involved in a corrupt relationship from those who stood to benefit every single action or inaction he took. The one fundamental problem here is Mr. Ciavarella deliberately or blindly is unwilling to recognize and unwilling to acknowledge. It's one thing to commit lawyers' hair-splitting games about the precise meaning of honest services mail fraud, especially when one knows that a Supreme Court case is pending the question of conflict of interest versus bribery or kickback. The deeper reality is here that the entire relationship, the entire pool of activities of Ciavarella was contaminated, and not just in juvenile cases, but in cases involving normal and regular civil business in the Luzerne County courts, where he was involved and corruptly involved with one or more other parties and systematically fails to disclose them. The evidence shows overall conduct consisting of corrupt relationships, lies, deceit, and evasion used to keep it from ever becoming disclosed. Ciavarella's rigid, questionable, and very questionable procedures in court fit this corrupt relationship like a hand in a glove. To that extent, his judicial conduct was a relevant factor in this case and was appropriately considered by the court pursuant to sentencing guidelines, and was certainly one of the basis on which the prosecution pursued to take the investigation. We again want to thank everyone for their cooperation and patience with the government during the painful process. I can't acknowledge deeply enough the career professional work through 3 U.S. attorneys here, the staff of the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, and the IRS in this case. Are there any questions?
Attorney, classify this as one of the worst judicial scandals in our country's history that you've seen.
Several of the accounts of this scandal referred to it as the worst judicial scandal in the history of the country. I don't know personally if I can say to confirm that. It certainly appears to be the worst judicial scandal in the history of Pennsylvania.
Mark Ciavarella had one final chance to talk to the judge before he was sentenced. Instead, he stood up and talked them almost in a defiant way. What's the reaction to that, and how did that hurt him before he was sentenced in your mind?
We listened very closely, as you all did, early in his personal statement. There seemed to be some dawning realization of what he had done and some acceptance of responsibility and some remorse. But then, for some reason which only a psychologist can explain, he decided to launch into a personal attack on one of the prosecutors, which was totally unwarranted, totally wrong, totally unjustified, based on a very self-serving conception of what the case was all about. Then he also decided to attack the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and the Interbranch Commission for their findings, and implied that he had a large trove of documents which no one had yet seen. We will hope that the Supreme Court, the Interbranch Commission, and the juvenile court system in Luzerne County and indeed throughout the state will get that information so they can assess the credibility of what Mr. Ciavarella said. But it indicated there's no true remorse, and there's a blind unwillingness to admit the overall seriousness of this conduct.
When you were clapping as you came out today, does that just show how polarizing this case has been from the start?
I don't know if polarizing is the word, but I think that I hope there's a sense of unity, and I hope the community will realize that the government in this case attempted to do its job as best as it could, given the reach of the criminal statutes. It attempted to take into account the interests of the community at every stage of this proceeding. In many cases, we had to proceed confidentially and secretly under the statutes and the rules that we have to operate in. In that sense, I appreciate the round of applause, and I accept it on behalf of the team behind it. We really did well.
He challenged the government to release his entire investigative file. Would you be willing to do that? He's saying that he didn't get a chance to disprove the kids for cash angle because you didn't present it at trial, and now he wants you to release his file.
We went through an 11-day trial where he was ably represented. He was free to call all the witnesses and produce all the documents he wanted. It's a little late in the game. It seems to be typical of part of Mr. Ciavarella's conduct. He knows, and his lawyers know, we can't release the file. We can't release grand jury information. Those files involve statements and evidence coming from other witnesses or regarding other activities which can't be disclosed. It's another example of, I would say, a perverse blindness and a misuse of what legal knowledge he has. The answer has to be no.
What about his complaint, though, that you didn't present the kids for cash angle at trial, therefore he never had a chance to defend himself against it?
I think Mr. Zubrod covered that appropriately this morning. The kids for cash angle is something that is unfortunately part of this case. Mr. Ciavarella and his lawyers choose to define it differently than we do. I'll stand by our definition.
Can we expect to see Judge Monahan sue now that the Ciavarella sentencing is out?
We would expect so. That's up to the court. We'll be ready for the sentencing when it comes up. And no one should underestimate Monahan's major role in this scheme.
Mr. Smith, do you think the trial strategy should open the door to this kind of pleading by Ciavarella? Would the community be better served if you guys had more scrambled at a kids for cash or a argument?
Well, we have to follow the evidence, and I'm speaking for the prosecutors here, and I'll invite any of them who wish to speak up on this, because they were actually the ones doing it. But the federal statutes set forth what the elements of the offenses are. We don't have general jurisdiction over the conduct of cases in Pennsylvania juvenile courts. There was very little, if any, evidence of any payments linked directly to any individual juvenile, but the fact is there that Ciavarella and Monahan established and maintained a corrupt secret relationship with Powell and Miracle, which involved the juvenile court. And Ciavarella was the judge of the juvenile court and sent many of the children who appeared before him, not all, but many of them, to those facilities. For a lot of reasons, some of which you heard alluded to this morning: the secrecy of grand jury proceedings, the difficulty after the fact of determining what would have been an appropriate resolution of a juvenile case. I think the proper decision was made by the prosecutors and investigators not to attempt to prove the case on the basis of each individual juvenile defendant, to show the overall scheme, because it was an overall scheme. Frankly, I don't think Ciavarella or Monahan themselves really personally cared where the juveniles went, as long as they can use their power to place the juveniles as leverage or control over Miracle and Powell, as was shown by some of the evidence presented in trial. Ciavarella's argument here is a very clever way to deflect attention to what the true evil of the scheme was. And I think our case was an attempt to get it back, to focus back on it.
At some point, Michael Conahan will expect a sentencing case. Does your team expect to ask for life in prison the way it did with Mark Ciavarella?
I think I can't comment on that at this point. Conahan did plead guilty, but we will work out an appropriate position based on the sentencing guidelines and the statutes, and we'll present that position at the sentencing of Conahan.
In your reaction to this sentence today, Mr. Ciavarella, do you feel the sentence today for Mr. Ciavarella was inappropriate?
We certainly feel it was appropriate.
Mr. Smith, Mr. Ciavarella in his monologue up there said that you guys were protecting Mr. Powell from charges of stealing $3 million from his partner. Were you protecting him? Was there any...
We were not protecting anybody. Mr. Powell was on the stand and testified extensively on direct and cross-examination. All of the evidence, documents, statements from Mr. Powell were made available to defense prior to trial, as is our obligation, as Ciavarella and his lawyers well knew. There was an assertion made, I believe, during the trial regarding Powell stealing money from his company. No evidence was presented to corroborate or support that statement, and to date, we've seen no evidence to support that assertion.
Can Mr. Zubrod speak?
Mr. Zubrod can speak very well, as we all know.
Family
Could I-
Court, Lackawanna County.
Could I just say
Family
that,
court.
I want to thank the
Corruption.
victims who kept faith with us during over years, which took tremendous emotional endurance, and they didn't stop. They kept with us. They understood that it was going to take time, and the justice ultimately would be done. We're really grateful.
Were they the motivating factor as pushed through and as their individual stories couldn't come out in court?
Absolutely.
Mr. Zubrod, there's a complaint where you remain marked in the public abuses against the gas term after the deal was struck, in which you would agree that that wasn't.
I don't recall coining that phrase. I did read it in the paper. I did use the term quid pro quo, that you're not standing back, because to deny that there is a quid pro quo would have been an admission by a party thinking that could be used against us in court. But I don't think the term kids for cash is inappropriate.
Why not?
Well, as Mr. Smith said, maybe not in a retail sense, I'll give you this kid if you give me so much money, but the clear understanding was, you don't keep paying us, you don't get any kids.
Would you say it's not an inappropriate one?
It's not an inappropriate reference.
Was Mr. Ciavarella's argument up there today sort of evidence of the he seems to be thinking everyone is wrong except him?
Well, I mean, Mr. Ciavarella's behavior has been consistent from the time he was on when he sat as a judge. You remember, lawyers began to challenge him on his relationship during trial with Robert Powell, and yet here he was sitting and making rulings, outrageous rulings in favor of Robert Powell. And when he was challenged on it, he went on the attack. And I think that's his way of doing things. You know, never retreat, always go on the attack, always blame somebody else, always get them back down. And he tried it. He tried it with the judge.
You talked about the justice system itself, and that in our lifetime, it may never be corrected to our satisfaction. Do you believe that's true?
Yeah, I quote General Security, who said, when he walked into Moscow, he said, "Here corruption reigns, that curse of human society which produces the arrogance of some, the degradation of others, and the corruption of us all." And that's exactly what he did.
Is the corruption probe in Luzerne County over? I mean, we're wrapping up one part of it now, but where do we go from here? Anywhere else?
I wish I could say yes.
Mr. Zubrod, is the county changing this prosecution, this investigation, and all the others? Honestly, is this corruption, is there a law
That's up to the citizens of Luzerne County. They've got to take ownership of the people that are put in there. They've got to look at these people. There's some outstanding people, attorneys and public officials in Luzerne County. It is clear anybody who ever sat and talked to Judge Ciavarella knew what he was. And citizens have to take responsibility for putting the right people. Why do you think this has gone so long? What do I think? I think it's because few had the courage to stand up, because he had the power to destroy them and everybody knew that.
You asked for life in prison for Mark Ciavarella until his natural death. After 28 years, are you satisfied with that?
Full justice was done. We got